Long before compasses were tucked into sailors' pockets or explorers' hands, people still had to move across fields, forests, and seas. They traveled, traded, hunted, and discovered new lands, all without the magnetic needle to guide them. How did they do it? The answer lies in careful observation, memory, and skills passed down from one generation to the next, from the stars in the night sky to the way moss grew on the side of a tree, from the flight of birds to the sound of waves against the shore. Early travelers read the world like a book. Each sign was a clue, each detail a piece of direction. Their journeys remind us that navigation was once a matter not of instruments, but of patience, attention, and tradition. Tonight, in Boring History for Sleep, we will gently explore how people found their way without compasses. From shepherds on winding hills to sailors crossing wide seas. From traders along ancient roads to villagers walking home at dusk. The world itself was their map. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can join again for more quiet journeys into the overlooked corners of history. Long before instruments, before charts carefully inked on parchment or compasses turning with the pull of the Earth's magnetism, there was only the world itself. And for countless generations, people learned to read it with patience, with attention, and with a sense of closeness that is difficult to imagine today. For them, the world was not silent. It spoke through shadows and breezes, through the shape of hills and the flow of rivers, through the light of the sun and the slow, steady turning of the stars. To find one's way was to listen to that voice. It required neither maps nor needles, only observation and memory, and the willingness to learn from those who had walked before. When travelers moved by day, the sun was their simplest companion. Rising in the east, setting in the west, it gave a broad frame of direction. Shepherds guiding flocks, farmers moving between distant fields, or traders carrying goods across roads, all knew to note the position of the sun in the sky. A glance upward, a shadow cast long or short, could reveal not only the hour but the direction of movement. To follow the morning light was to move east. To chase the sinking glow was to walk west. At noon, when the sun sat highest, shadows disappeared beneath the feet. A natural clock and compass in one, yet the sun alone was not enough. Clouds might cover the sky, or journeys might last long into dusk. Then, travelers looked to other signs. The growth of plants offered guidance. Moss often grew thickest on the shaded, northern sides of trees, while branches tended to reach more strongly toward the south where the sunlight was strongest. Experienced wanderers learned to see these details as markers, as natural arrows pointing the way. The tilt of a hillside, the bend of a tree, the dampness of soil, all could be read like words on a page, revealing the hidden compass of the land. Waterways, too, were teachers of direction. Rivers rarely flowed aimlessly. They carved their way toward greater waters, and to follow them was to find both direction and life. A traveler who found a stream could follow its current downhill to reach larger rivers and often, eventually, settlements. Conversely, to follow a river upward was to move toward its source, to the highlands where springs bubbled and hills rose. In this way, rivers were both guides and companions, offering routes across unfamiliar lands. Animals carried their own wisdom, and keen observers learned from their behavior. Birds, for example, often revealed direction through their flight. Migratory flocks traveled in broad, predictable paths, and to see them was to glimpse the great invisible highways of the sky. Fishermen and coastal dwellers knew the cries of seabirds that rarely flew far from shore. To watch their movements was to know whether land was near or far. Herd animals, too, tended to follow familiar tracks to water, paths worn into the earth that could lead travelers toward rivers, lakes, or safe grazing grounds. In every case, the animal world provided signals for those patient enough to notice. 18 night. The stars became the surest guides. Long before the compass needle, sailors and shepherds alike looked upward to find constellations. Some stars never moved from their place, circling the sky with quiet constancy, while others marked the passing of seasons. By tracing the steady presence of northern stars, travelers oriented themselves in the dark. Stories were woven into the constellations, myths that gave memory to their positions, so that even children could recall which cluster of lights pointed north or south. To look at the stars was to look at the oldest map, vast and eternal, drawn not by hands but by the universe itself. Even the wind and the weather gave direction. In some lands, winds came most often from one quarter, steady enough that travelers used them as markers. On coasts, the smell of salt carried inland with the breeze, reminding those far from the water where the sea lay. Rainfall, too, was not random but shaped by the lay of mountains and valleys, patterns that seasoned eyes could recognize. To live close to the land was to learn these patterns, to fold them into memory until the world itself seemed always to be giving quiet hints of direction. What makes these practices striking is how deeply they depended on attention. To move without compass or map was to notice what most of us would overlook today: a shadow leaning eastward, a bird veering toward the sea, the damp side of a tree trunk. Such things were not trivial but essential. The natural world was not decoration but information, a living guidebook that never left one's side. It demanded patience, for these signs did not shout but whispered, and only those who listened carefully could hear them. Knowledge of natural navigation was passed from generation to generation. Elders taught children how to read shadows, how to find constellations, how to notice the curve of moss or the bend of branches. It was not written in books, but carried in memory, preserved in stories and practices. A father might place his son's hand against the rough bark of a north-facing tree, or a mother might point to the stars at night, giving names that carried both myth and meaning. In this way, communities carried within themselves the maps they needed, stored not in ink, but in the minds of their people. To navigate by the natural world was also to live in harmony with it. The traveler was not separate from the land, but part of it, moving as animals moved, guided by the same rhythms of sun, moon, and season. Journeys were not measured only in distance, but in changes of light and sound, the shift of birdsong, the rise of evening winds, the deepening of shadows. In this closeness lay a kind of wisdom, a knowledge not of abstract directions, but of the world as it truly was. Alive and constant. It was that, long before compasses, people moved with confidence across landscapes vast and varied. They trusted the sun to rise and set, the rivers to flow, the stars to turn, the moss to grow, the birds to fly. They read the world as their guide, and in doing so, they left behind no maps, but memories, no instruments, but stories, and no monuments, but the quiet knowledge that to live was to listen. This was the first compass, the world itself. Before compasses, before printed maps or written charts, people carried their landscapes in their minds. Memory was the map, and stories were the ink that preserved it. Every hill, every bend in the river, every ancient tree was more than scenery. It was a landmark, a signpost, a marker of where one was and where one needed to go. The world itself was read and remembered, and this memory, passed carefully from one generation to the next, created an invisible network of knowledge that guided countless journeys across fields, deserts, and seas. To travel without instruments meant learning to see places not as anonymous, but as unique, each with features so distinct they could never be mistaken. A solitary oak in the middle of a plain, a rock shaped like an animal, or a waterfall with a particular sound became fixed points in the mental maps of communities. Shepherds could find their way home by the outline of a ridge against the sky. Hunters remembered the position of a fallen tree or the way a valley curved between hills. Farmers, Moving from village to market, measured distance by familiar stones at crossroads or shrines at the edges of fields. Each landmark was a chapter in a larger story, written not on paper but on the earth itself. The human mind, trained in this way, developed extraordinary powers of recall. What might seem to us like ordinary countryside was, to those who lived in it, filled with remembered detail. A traveler could walk miles guided not by compass but by memory, following one remembered landmark to the next. In places where paths were faint or ever-changing, such as shifting sands or seasonal floods, the skill of memorizing landmarks was life itself. To forget was to be lost. To remember was to survive. Oral traditions carried this memory further. Communities turned landscapes into stories, binding geography to narrative so that it could be remembered easily. A mountain was not only high, it was the resting place of a hero, or the seat of a spirit, or the scene of a legendary battle. A river bend was not only a turn in the water, but the place where ancestors had fished or traded. By linking memory to myth, communities ensured that even children could carry the knowledge of the land long before they ever needed it. To know the story was to know the path. This was especially vital in cultures without writing. Songs, poems, and chants described routes in a rhythm easy to recall. In some traditions, navigation itself became a kind of recitation. A trader or shepherd could walk the land singing verses that described the landmarks in sequence. A hill here, a ford there, a grove of trees beyond. To follow the song was to follow the road. These oral maps were durable, able to survive centuries. For even if the landscape shifted slightly, the story preserved the essentials of direction and place in villages. Elders acted as living libraries of such knowledge. They remembered the old routes across valleys, the hidden passes through mountains, the safe crossings of rivers. Younger generations learned by walking with them, by hearing the stories told aloud during journeys, by seeing the landmarks with their own eyes. Learning to navigate was not a single lesson, but a lifelong apprenticeship, beginning in childhood and continuing until one could walk confidently alone in regions with dramatic natural features. Landmarks became almost sacred. A single peak visible for miles might guide travelers across vast plains. A particular rock formation, twisted into a strange shape, might be known to every trader who passed along the route. Even in more subtle landscapes, where hills and trees seemed alike, skilled travelers noticed the smallest differences, the way one tree leaned, the unusual color of soil in one field, the bend of a stream that curved a little sharper than the rest. The mind, sharpened by use, turned these details into a compass more precise than any needle. These methods were not limited to land. On the sea, too, oral tradition and memory played their part. Before compasses, sailors hugged coastlines, remembering the shapes of headlands, the color of cliffs, the pattern of bays. They told stories of rocks shaped like animals, of coves with certain smells or sounds, of mountains that rose from the sea like beacons. These landmarks at sea, combined with memory of wind and current, allowed sailors to venture far without written charts. Their oral maps were as strong as paper ones, carried in minds rather than in hands in deserts, where landmarks seemed scarce. Memory focused on subtle features, the way dunes aligned, the color of distant ridges, the presence of a solitary well. Caravans moved by following these remembered points, passing knowledge down the line of generations. Even in the vast emptiness, memory created paths invisible to outsiders, but clear to those who had learned the land. The role of memory and landmarks reveals something deeper about how people once related to their environment. They did not see land as a neutral backdrop, but as filled with meaning. Each place was storied, remembered, valued. To walk across a valley was to walk through memory, to pass markers left not in ink, but in recollection. It created a world where geography and history were inseparable. where place was always personal. Today, when we rely on printed maps or digital screens, it is easy to forget the immense skill involved in such navigation. But in the centuries before compasses, this skill was as essential as farming or building. To know the land was to belong to it, to be safe within it, to be able to find one's way home. Landmarks and oral traditions formed the backbone of this knowledge, invisible but enduring, shaping the way countless people traveled, traded, and lived. In truth, memory was the earliest map, and stories were the first compasses. When daylight faded and the sun no longer gave it steady guidance, travelers turned their eyes upward to the heavens. For countless centuries before compasses, the night sky was the most reliable map humanity possessed. The stars, silent yet constant, gave direction across fields, deserts, and seas. They marked not only north and south, but also seasons and time, guiding journeys great and small. To follow the stars was to walk with the oldest and most enduring companions of humankind, whose patterns have remained unchanged for thousands of years. The most important of these guides was the fixed star, the one that seemed to hold still while all others wheeled around it. In the northern hemisphere, this was Polaris, the North Star. It stood almost directly above the Earth's axis of rotation, meaning it always appeared in the same place in the sky, north. For shepherds tending flocks at night, for travelers crossing wide plains, and for sailors far from land, Polaris was a faithful beacon. To find it was to know the direction of north with certainty. Many oral traditions taught children simple ways to locate the star, often through the constellation of the Great Bear or the Big Dipper, whose two-edged stars point toward it. With this knowledge, even the youngest could orient themselves under the open sky. But Polaris was not the only guide. Constellations served as great signposts, their shapes remembered through stories and myths. The hunter with his belt, the swan with outstretched wings, the lion in the sky. These were not only tales, but tools. Farmers knew that when certain constellations rose at dusk, planting season had begun. Sailors knew that when others set below the horizon, storms might follow. By watching where the constellations rose and fell, travelers could orient themselves, knowing east from west as surely as if they had a compass in hand. The stars also carried time within them. Each season revealed its own sky, with new constellations appearing as the Earth turned through the year. Those who knew the stars could read the calendar in the heavens, measuring the progress of months not with paper, but with light. This was vital for long journeys. A caravan crossing deserts might rely on the stars not only for direction, but for knowing how far into the season they had traveled. How much longer until the rains or the cold? For sailors, the stars gave reassurance that their voyage moved forward not into chaos, but in rhythm with the turning of the world on the open sea. The stars were indispensable. With no landmarks, no rivers or trees, sailors relied on the sky above them. Polynesian navigators, for example, used the stars as a compass rose, memorizing where each star rose on the horizon. By keeping the rising or setting of a particular star aligned with the bow of their canoe, they could sail for days across vast oceans with astonishing precision. European sailors, too, learned to read the night sky, using the North Star and constellations to hold their course across stormy waters. Long before compasses were common, the heavens offered a sure path over the endless, shifting sea. The moon added its own guidance. Its phases told time, while its position gave direction. When waxing, it pointed roughly westward in the evening. When waning, it pointed eastward in the morning. Eclipses, too, though rare, were noted by careful observers and became part of oral calendars that linked sky and earth together. The sky was not random. It was patterned, and those patterns were remembered and retold with reverence. The connection between stars and navigation was not purely practical. It was also cultural and spiritual. To many peoples, the stars were ancestors, heroes or deities placed in the sky to guide the living. Their movements carried meaning beyond direction, offering reassurance, order, and a sense of belonging to the cosmos. When travelers followed the stars, they were not only navigating, they were also participating in traditions that stretched back to the dawn of human memory. To look at the night sky was to see not only the present path, but the footsteps of countless generations who had walked beneath the same lights. What makes this reliance on the stars remarkable is the precision it allowed without instruments. A skilled navigator could look at the angle of Polaris above the horizon and know their latitude, their position north or south. They could measure the time of night by the rising of constellations. They could hold a course over hundreds of miles simply by keeping a star aligned with their direction of travel. These were achievements of observation and memory, not of technology, and they reveal the immense power of human attention when sharpened by necessity. Stories ensured that such knowledge was never forgotten. A parent might point out the stars to a child, weaving myths into memory. Follow the hunter's belt, and you will know east. Look to the swan, and you will find the river's mouth. Watch the lion, and you will know when to plant. These tales carried both wonder and instruction, ensuring that the practical knowledge of navigation was never dry but alive with meaning. The sky itself became a storybook, and each star a word within it. Thus, the stars were more than distant lights. They were maps, clocks, calendars, and companions. They gave certainty when the land was strange, when clouds hid the sun, when no landmarks stood on the horizon. They were faithful in their order, rising and setting each night in patterns that never betrayed those who depended on them. Long before compasses, people trusted the stars, and in their glow they found both direction and comfort that eye in truth. To follow the stars was to carry the oldest compass of all, one written across the heavens. Eternal, vast, and always waiting to be read by those who looked upward. Long before compasses guided sailors and traders across vast distances, people turned to the movements of water and the steady breath of the wind. These elements, often feared for their unpredictability, became faithful guides for those who learned to read them carefully. Water carved paths across the land, and wind traced invisible roads across the sky and sea. To follow them was to travel with nature itself, trusting the rhythms of currents and breezes that had shaped landscapes and lives for millennia on land. Rivers were among the most reliable guides. A river could not be mistaken, for its waters always flowed with purpose. To follow its course was to be assured of direction, for rivers led to valleys, to greater streams, and finally to seas. Farmers and traders used rivers as natural highways, walking along their banks or traveling in small boats. Villages grew beside them, bridges spanned them, and markets clustered at their crossings. To move with a river was not only to find one's way, but also to find other people, for settlements and commerce followed wherever water flowed. Even the bends and turns of rivers became part of memory. A sharp curve around a rock, a waterfall crashing down a ledge, a fork where two streams joined. These were landmarks as strong as mountains. Travelers remembered them as points along the journey, oral maps written in the flow of water. By day, the shimmer of sunlight on the surface revealed direction. By night, the sound of rushing current could be followed through forests or plains, a voice in the darkness leading onward. Seas and oceans required greater skill. Here, water and wind combined to create paths unseen by untrained eyes. Sailors learned to read the surface of the sea, the color of the water, the presence of long, steady swells, the way foam lined itself into streaks. These signs revealed underlying currents, vast rivers within the ocean itself. To follow them was to move with ease. To resist them was to struggle. Polynesian navigators, for example, memorized the patterns of swells, knowing from their angle and rhythm which way distant islands lay. The sea itself became a map, its waves and swells pointing like silent arrows. Wind, too, revealed direction. On land, steady breezes often came predictably from one quarter, shaped by geography. Farmers and travelers knew which way the wind most often blew at certain times of year, and they used this knowledge to orient themselves. On coasts, the smell of salt carried inland with the wind, announcing the presence of the sea even before it could be seen. To feel the breeze on one's face was to sense direction without sight. On the ocean, winds were even more crucial. Long before compasses, sailors had learned the steady cycles of the trade winds, those great belts of wind that sweep the globe. In the Atlantic, for instance, steady easterlies carried ships westward, while other winds brought them back again. Early navigators knew that by trusting these winds, they could cross oceans with certainty. To set sail without understanding the winds was folly, but to master them was to unlock the world. Clouds and weather also added their guidance. Certain shapes of clouds revealed nearby land, for islands often created their own weather patterns. Seabirds rode the winds in predictable ways, showing sailors which direction the breezes carried them. Even the smell of air could change with the wind, carrying hints of vegetation or the dryness of distant deserts. Experienced travelers noticed these subtle cues, reading them as clearly as others might read a map. The use of water and wind as guides reveals a deeper truth, that early navigation was not about imposing order upon the world, but about cooperating with it. A traveler who followed a river was not fighting the land, but moving with its shape. A sailor who followed the trade winds was not defying the sea, but trusting its rhythms. Navigation was a partnership with nature, an understanding that the earth itself provided pathways if only one had the patience to see them. Oral traditions ensured that this knowledge endured. Elders taught young sailors how to watch the waves, how to feel the pull of currents beneath the boat, how to notice the change of wind on the skin. Caravans crossing deserts were taught to listen for the sound of distant water carried on the breeze. Stories linked landmarks with rivers, winds with seasons, so that memory preserved what no parchment could capture fully. In this way, the invisible became visible, and the uncertain became dependable. Even on the smallest scale, wind and water guided daily life. A farmer might judge which direction to plow by the prevailing breeze. A fisherman knew which way to cast his net by the movement of ripples. A traveler crossing hills knew that the damp smell of air carried by the wind often marked the approach of rivers or lakes. Each clue was slight, but together they formed a network of knowledge that allowed safe passage across both land and sea. In truth, to navigate by water and wind was to trust in forces greater than oneself, forces as old as the world. They whispered direction without words, steady and constant, waiting for those who would listen. To walk beside a river or to sail with a breeze was to move with certainty even without compass or chart. Thus, long before the magnetic needle pointed the way, paths already existed, etched in currents, drawn in breezes, written in waves. To follow them was to follow the Earth's oldest guides. Before compasses gave certainty with a single glance, travelers looked upward to the sky each morning. The heavens, bright with sun and streaked with clouds, offered clues as steady as any instrument. By day, the sky was not a backdrop, but a guide, filled with patterns of light and shadow, movement and stillness. To read the sky was to know direction, time, and even weather ahead, skills that shepherds, farmers, sailors, and wanderers alike relied upon for centuries. The most obvious of these guides was the sun. Its rising and setting gave the broad strokes of direction, east and west. To those who lived close to the land, this was not an abstract idea, but a daily rhythm woven into their lives. Farmers in villages knew which hills first caught the morning light, and which valleys glowed last in the evening, using these signs to orient themselves. Travelers on the road could simply turn their faces toward the rising sun to know east, or toward the setting glow to know west. Even at midday, when the sun reached its highest point, it told direction, casting the shortest shadow of the day, pointing north and south. Yet the sun offered more than direction. It marked time with precision. The length and angle of shadows, noted carefully, revealed not only the hour but also the season. A shepherd could place a staff in the ground and watch its shadow shift across the earth, learning how far the day had gone. Whole communities once built simple sundials, stones aligned with the path of the sun, transforming the sky into a clock. To know the time was to know how much daylight remained for travel, for labor, or for rest. Clouds added their own guidance. Their shapes and movements often revealed the direction of the wind, and thus the approach of weather. High, thin cirrus clouds, stretched across the sky, signaled winds blowing from distant places. Low, heavy clouds, moving steadily, told of rain or storms approaching. For travelers, these signs mattered greatly. To read the clouds was to prepare, to decide whether to continue or to seek shelter. For sailors, the cloud patterns on the horizon could mean the difference between smooth sailing and danger. In this way, the daytime sky not only gave direction but also foresight. The color of the sky itself carried meaning. A pale, clear morning often promised calm, while a deep red at dawn or dusk signaled shifts in weather. The old saying, "Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning," was not poetry alone but observation distilled into memory. Such proverbs were passed down so that even children could learn to read the sky with ease. Birds and their flight patterns were also tied to the daytime sky. Migratory flocks used the sun to guide their journeys, and by watching them, humans learned to predict direction and season alike. Fishermen noticed how seabirds circled higher on clear days, their flights steadier when winds came from a certain direction. A traveler could lift their eyes, see the tilt of wings against the sun, and know where land or sea lay beyond sight. The clarity of the horizon also mattered. In flat lands or deserts, the shimmering line where earth met sky became a compass of its own. Heat rising from the ground created mirages, yet skilled travelers learned to read these illusions, distinguishing false lakes from real ones by their movement and consistency. To misjudge could be deadly, but to read correctly was to survive. Mountains and hills interacted with the daytime sky in ways that offered direction as well. Peaks caught sunlight at predictable times, their shadows sweeping across valleys like vast sundials. A traveler might know that when a certain ridge fell into shadow, midday had passed, or when a peak gleamed golden, the evening was near. In this way, land and sky worked together to tell both time and direction. Daytime skies also revealed the change of seasons. The sun rose and set in different places along the horizon as the year passed, and careful watchers marked these shifts. Ancient stone alignments, circles, and monuments in many lands show that people recorded these patterns with care, building calendars into the very landscape. For everyday travelers, such knowledge ensured that journeys began at the right time of year, guided by the same sun that had guided their ancestors for centuries. He who read the daytime sky was to practice patience. The sun did not hurry. The clouds drifted slowly. The shadows lengthened at their own pace. A traveler had to learn to wait, to watch, to let the world reveal itself in its own time. This calm attention shaped not only navigation but also a way of life, one in which people moved with nature rather than against it. In truth, the sky was the greatest teacher of all. It gave direction through the rising and setting of the sun, time through the movement of shadows, warning through the shapes of clouds, and reassurance through its steady rhythm. To those who learned to read it, the daytime sky was never empty, but always full of meaning. Thus, long before compasses, the heavens above guided every step below. Long before the invention of compasses or the drawing of detailed maps, the Earth itself carried the memory of human movement. Across valleys, through forests, over hills and plains, trails and footpaths crisscrossed the land like veins beneath skin. These were not planned by surveyors or marked by signposts, but shaped by use. The repeated footsteps of travelers, the herds of animals, the daily walks of shepherds and villagers. To follow such paths was to step into history itself, for each track bore the imprint of countless lives that had already passed that way. In the earliest communities, people moved where the land allowed. They avoided marshes, steep cliffs, and thick undergrowth, favoring ridges, riverbanks, and open ground. Over time, their choices wore faint tracks into the soil. What began as the narrow tread of hunters following game became clear footpaths as families and neighbors traced the same routes again and again. These trails, unmarked yet unmistakable, became the first highways, guiding people without the need for instruments or charts. Animals played their part too. Herds of deer or bison, elephants or antelope, followed the same tracks to water and grazing year after year. Humans noticed, and in many cases adopted these routes for themselves. The paths animals created were often the easiest ways through difficult terrain, for beasts, like people, sought safety and efficiency. Even today, archaeologists find ancient human trails that follow the same lines as animal tracks, evidence of a shared logic written into the land. Once formed, these trails became threads of connection. Villages linked to one another by footpaths. Markets drew people along well-worn routes. Seasonal migrations followed the same trails year after year. Each track carried memory. A bend around a rock told of an obstacle avoided. A detour through a grove marked where shelter had once been needed. Over generations, these trails were passed down as part of communal knowledge. Elders would tell the young, "Follow the path where the earth is worn bare. It will lead you to the river. From the river, follow the track through the trees, and you will come to the fields." For those traveling unfamiliar lands, trails were lifelines. To find a path was to find direction, reassurance that others had passed before. A faint depression in the grass, a line of stones discolored by countless feet, a strip of soil packed firm and bare, these were signs of safety. To follow them was to avoid wandering, to trust the experience of countless unseen travelers. Over time, these footpaths widened into trade routes. Caravans wore them deeper, merchants traced them farther, pilgrims sanctified them with their journeys. Entire networks of roads began this way, first as faint animal tracks, then as human footpaths, and later as great highways connecting kingdoms. To walk such a path was to share in a collective memory of movement, to participate in a tradition that stretched back beyond written history. Even the smallest footpaths held meaning. In villages, paths led from cottage to well, from barn to field, from field to market. These were the daily routes of ordinary life, known so well that people could walk them even in the dark. Over time, they became ingrained in community identity, each bend and turn carrying stories of those who had walked them before. For travelers, to find such a path was to find entry into human company, a promise that settlement lay not far ahead. Paths could also be deceptive. Some faded with disuse, overgrown by grass or swallowed by forest. Others forked, requiring careful choice. In such cases, oral tradition guided travelers. Stories told which fork led to safety, which to danger. Songs and proverbs warned of misleading tracks, cautioning against taking the shorter path that might lead into marsh or wilderness. To walk wisely was to know which paths to trust. For sailors and fishermen, paths existed on water as well. Along coastlines, repeated journeys created mental maps of safe passages, places where boats could beach, coves that provided shelter. These water trails were remembered as carefully as land routes. Invisible but no less real in forests, footpaths were often subtle, marked only by broken twigs, bent grass, or the faint trace of ash where fires had once been lit. Hunters and wood gatherers learned to notice these signs, to distinguish a true trail from a mere animal track. They carried this knowledge in their minds, passing it down through families so that the forest itself became a network of remembered routes. Trails and tracks also reveal the cooperative nature of early navigation. No single person created them. They were the collective work of communities, animals, and generations. Each footstep reinforced the path for the next traveler, binding people together across time. To walk a trail was to inherit the guidance of countless others, to be part of a larger story written into the soil itself. Even in regions where the landscape seemed endless, plains without trees, deserts without landmarks, paths endured. They were marked by cairns of stones piled by travelers, by fires left smoldering, by bones of animals sacrificed to the journey. These markers kept the trail alive, guiding the next group as surely as if a line had been drawn across the land. Thus, long before compasses, trails, tracks, and footpaths were the most reliable guides of all. They required no instruments, no calculation, only trust in the memory of those who had walked before. They remind us that navigation is never only about finding direction, but also about connection. The invisible bond between past and present, between one traveler and the next. Every path was a story, every trail a memory, every footstep a part of the great web of movement that shaped human history. To follow them was to follow not only a direction, but a tradition, to walk not alone, but in the company of all who had ever passed that way. Long before compasses, sextants, or printed maps, humans shared their world with creatures whose instincts for direction were sharper than any instrument. Animals, and even the smallest insects, moved with a purpose that astonished careful observers. By watching their habits, travelers learned to borrow from this natural wisdom, finding paths, water, and direction where none seemed clear. The forest, the plain, the desert, and the sea were alive with guides, winged, hoofed, or crawling, each leaving clues to those who had the patience to notice. Birds were among the most trusted of these guides. Their flight carried meaning far beyond beauty. Migratory flocks crossed entire continents, rising in great formations that revealed not only the turning of seasons, but the direction of travel. To see geese or swans flying in lines high above was to know the way toward warmer lands in autumn or cooler regions in spring. Traders and shepherds, seeing these patterns, took note. If birds followed a particular course, there lay a dependable route. Along coasts, seabirds gave even more practical guidance. Gulls and terns rarely strayed far from land. Sailors who spotted them knew that shore must be near, even when the horizon offered nothing but water. Their cries, their flight back toward nests, became signals that safety was not far away on land. The movements of herds revealed paths as old as time. Wild animals knew the routes to rivers and lakes, to fertile grazing grounds, to safe passages between mountains. Hunters and nomads followed these tracks, at first for the sake of survival, but soon also for navigation. The repeated trampling of hooves carved trails into the soil, trails that humans remembered and reused. Elephants, in particular, created paths across forests that became highways for people long after the animals had passed. To follow an animal's track was to follow the wisdom of countless generations of instinct. Even the smallest signs mattered. The behavior of insects was often studied for clues. Ants, for example, built nests that opened in predictable directions, often angled toward the warmth of the morning sun. Their steady lines of movement revealed sources of food or water. In arid lands, travelers watched for bees, for they rarely flew far from water. A swarm in the distance was a sure sign that a stream or pond was near, hidden perhaps to human eyes, but never beyond the notice of the hive. In this way, even the humblest creatures provided life-saving guidance. Domesticated animals also played their part. Horses, donkeys, and camels, long companions of human travel, often sensed the right path when humans faltered. A thirsty camel could smell water from far across the desert. A horse might hesitate at a dangerous crossing. Experienced travelers trusted their animals, letting them lead when human judgment was uncertain. In many cultures, it was said that to lose trust in your beast was to risk being lost yourself. In forests, the calls of birds revealed direction to those who listened carefully. Certain species sang at dawn facing east, their songs marking the rise of the sun. Others grew silent before storms, warning of changes in weather long before clouds gathered. For people without compasses, these natural signals were as clear as any chart. To sit quietly and listen was to hear the earth's own instructions, delivered by wings and voices above. Fish and sea creatures, too, offered guidance. In coastal waters, the presence of certain fish revealed proximity to land, for they fed only in shallow areas. The leap of dolphins near ships often reassured sailors that islands were close. Fishermen knew which tides carried which species, learning to predict currents and direction through the behavior of the sea's inhabitants. Even the floating trails of jellyfish or seaweed told of currents beneath the waves, currents that could be followed like invisible roads. What made this reliance on animals and insects remarkable was not only its practicality, but its patience. Humans had to slow themselves, to watch, to listen, to accept that the creatures around them often knew better. Navigation became less an act of imposing will upon the world, and more an act of humility, of recognizing that wisdom lay in the habits of even the smallest ant or the flight of a distant bird. Oral traditions preserved this knowledge. Elders told children, "Watch the bees, and you will find water. Watch the gulls, and you will find land. Trust the path of the herds, and you will never be lost." These lessons, woven into stories and proverbs, ensured that no generation forgot the guidance written into nature itself. In some cultures, animals were even seen as teachers, spiritual guides whose movements carried messages meant for human eyes. Whether framed in myth or in practical advice, the meaning was the same: pay attention, and the world will lead you. This way of navigating also created a bond between humans and the creatures they observed. To follow the birds or the bees was to admit kinship with them, to see oneself as part of the same world rather than apart from it. Journeys became less solitary, for every wing beat and every track in the soil became a companion. Even silence was full of guidance. The sudden absence of song before rain, the hush of insects before nightfall. All of it spoke to those who knew how to listen. Thus, long before compasses, people found their way by walking with animals and insects as guides. They looked upward to birds, outward to herds, downward to ants and bees. Each offered knowledge, freely given, needing only observation in return. In trusting them, travelers found water, land, and safe passage. And in doing so, they discovered that the world was never empty, but always alive with direction. In truth, every journey was shared. To follow an animal's track was to follow a story older than humankind itself, a story written in instinct and repeated across generations. And so, the smallest bee, the farthest bird, the quiet herd moving toward water, all became signposts. They were the living compasses of the world, long before iron needles pointed north. For people who lived without compasses, plants and trees were not merely part of the scenery. They were teachers, silent but constant. The natural world offered direction through its growth, through the way leaves leaned, roots spread, bark darkened, and moss thrived. To those who paid attention, forests and meadows became maps. each stem and branch pointing quietly toward water, sun, or shelter. In a world without instruments, people turned to vegetation for the guidance they needed, finding direction in every field and grove. Moss was among the most familiar of these signs. It often grew thickest on the shaded, damper sides of trees and rocks. In northern lands, this usually meant the northern face, sheltered from direct sun. Travelers, hunters, and shepherds alike would glance at the base of a trunk and read the green carpet as though it were a compass needle. To a stranger, moss might seem random, but to the practiced eye, its patterns revealed orientation. Even in forests where every tree looked alike, the green veil of moss told of direction, ensuring that one could move with confidence. The shape of trees also carried meaning. In open spaces, branches tended to grow more strongly toward the south in the northern hemisphere, reaching toward the warmth of the sun. The southern side of a tree was often fuller, its bark lighter and drier, while the northern side remained darker, rougher, or damper. Farmers knew this instinctively, and travelers borrowed the same knowledge. A single oak or pine standing in a field could become a compass, its limbs stretching to tell where the sun most often shone. In forests, where sunlight filtered unevenly, plants revealed subtle differences. Ferns and shade-loving plants clustered on cooler, damper sides of rocks and trees, while sun-loving grasses thrived on the opposite slopes. By noticing which plants dominated which side of a hill, one could tell the general direction of sun and shade. These clues, combined with memory of local climate, formed a reliable guide. Flowers, too, followed the sun. Many species turned their blossoms to face the light, tracking its movement across the sky. A traveler could look at the way petals angled in the morning or evening and know where the sun had risen or would soon set. Whole meadows became maps, their faces leaning in unison toward the light. Such signs required patience and a gentle eye, for the changes were subtle, but to those who depended on them, the flowers gave direction as surely as stars. Trees also revealed the presence of water, an equally vital guide. Willows, alders, and poplars grew thick near rivers and streams, their roots thirsty for constant moisture. To see them in a landscape was to know water lay nearby, even if hidden behind banks or tall grasses. In deserts, lone palms marked oases, their green crowns signaling life amid dryness. Travelers knew to follow the line of vegetation, for where plants grew luscious, water must be close. In this way, trees not only gave orientation but also led to survival itself. Even the wear of bark told stories. Winds and rain struck trees more heavily from certain directions, shaping one side smoother, the other rougher. Lichens painted their pale crust more thickly on the shaded sides. Experienced eyes read these patterns instinctively, treating trunks as natural signposts in an otherwise confusing forest. Fields and crops also revealed direction. Farmers, guided by generations of observation, planted according to the lay of the sun and the slope of land. Their work left visible patterns that others could read. Rows of vines leaned toward the morning sun, while grains bent with prevailing winds. For travelers passing through cultivated lands, these human-made landscapes carried the same guidance as wild vegetation. Linking natural wisdom with human tradition, seasonal change deepened the guidance of plants. In spring, certain slopes blossomed earlier, always those most open to the sun. In autumn, leaves turned sooner on cooler, shaded sides of valleys. These rhythms, predictable and visible, were woven into oral tradition. Look to the side where leaves fall first, and you will know where the shadows linger longest. In this way, the cycle of growth and decay became part of navigation. The connection between people and vegetation was intimate. Farmers, shepherds, hunters, and wanderers all learned to trust the signs of plants as companions on their paths. Parents taught children to place a hand on bark, to feel the damp side and the dry side, to notice where moss clung thickest, to follow the line of trees to hidden water. These lessons, passed gently across generations, made the forest a book always open to those willing to read. Such reliance on plants reveals a truth about life before instruments. People lived in deep observation, noticing what we might now pass by without thought. A patch of moss, a leaning branch, a cluster of ferns. These were not small details, but the very language of survival. To navigate by plants was to live in harmony with them, to treat the earth itself as a guide. Thus, long before compasses, people found their way by the green signs around them. Moss on trunks, branches leaning toward light, blossoms turning to the sun, trees revealing water. All these formed a compass written in leaves and roots. The forest was never silent. It spoke in its growth, and those who listened walked with confidence that in truth, every tree was a landmark, every plant a pointer, every field a map. In a world without compasses, printed maps, or written charts, the most reliable guides were not objects at all, but people. Knowledge of routes, paths, and safe passages lived in memory, and that memory was shared from generation to generation through words, songs, and stories. Communities carried geography within them like an inheritance, ensuring that even those who had never traveled far could find their way when the time came. Oral knowledge, passed along in countless forms, was the glue that held early navigation together, binding individuals into a collective memory of the land. Every journey began with teaching. Children grew up listening to elders describe the world beyond their homes. Around fires, in fields, or during long evenings, stories were told of routes through forests, across rivers, over mountains. A bend in a stream, a tree with a crooked trunk, a stone that resembled an animal. These landmarks were woven into tales that were easier to remember than dry directions. The language of navigation was not abstract, but vivid, full of images and characters. In this way, even a child who had never left the village might know how to reach a distant market or shrine, guided by the stories stored in memory. Songs were particularly powerful. A rhythm, once learned, could carry long lists of landmarks without effort. Whole routes could be memorized in verse, past the standing stone, through the grove of ash. Follow the stream until the hill of hawks. The rhyme and beat made the knowledge unshakable, like a melody that could not be forgotten. Travelers sometimes sang quietly to themselves on the road, recalling the verses that linked one landmark to the next. In this way, the song became a map, sung step by step until the journey was complete. Proverbs and sayings also preserved knowledge of routes. Simple phrases condensed generations of experience into a few words: where the river bends, the market lies, or follow the ridge until the twin oaks stand. These short lines were easy to remember, passing quickly from one person to another, repeated until they became common wisdom. A stranger asking for directions might be told not in long explanations, but in a single proverb that carried all the information needed. The communal nature of oral knowledge meant that no one person needed to know everything. Instead, memory was distributed. A shepherd might know the paths of the high pastures, while a fisherman remembered the routes along the coast. A trader carried in mind the sequence of markets across valleys, while a pilgrim held the verses that led to shrines. When shared, these pieces formed a web of knowledge that linked entire regions together. To join a community was to gain access to its maps of memory. This sharing was also an act of trust. Knowledge of routes was valuable, for it ensured survival. To pass it on was to care for the next generation. Parents taught children, neighbors guided newcomers, elders reminded the forgetful. In dangerous regions, deserts, mountains, dense forests, oral memory was the difference between safety and peril. Without it, a traveler could easily be lost. With it, They walked with the invisible company of those who had walked before, that in some cultures, navigation became formalized into rituals of memory. Apprenticeship ensured that younger travelers learned directly from experienced ones. A young trader might accompany an elder along routes several times, listening as each landmark was named aloud, repeated, and fixed in mind. Only after years of such repetition would the apprentice be trusted to lead alone. This method required patience, but it built a depth of memory far stronger than written words. Oral knowledge also allowed routes to stretch across great distances. Caravans crossing deserts relied on long chains of memory, each oasis remembered in sequence, each dune described with reference to others. Sailors remembered the order of islands, their shapes and colors, their distances apart, often preserved in songs that described them like beads on a string. These oral maps could span hundreds of miles, precise enough to bring travelers home even when landmarks seemed indistinguishable to outsiders. The reliability of shared memory was reinforced by repetition. Markets, pilgrimages, seasonal journeys, all repeated the same routes, year after year. Each repetition refreshed memory, ensuring that knowledge did not fade. A road was not only walked, it was spoken, sung, and remembered collectively. Even those who never traveled far learned it indirectly through stories told by those who returned. This method of navigation also shaped identity. A community was defined not only by its people, but by the routes it remembered. The knowledge of paths, rivers, and landmarks became part of belonging. To forget them was to risk exclusion, while to know them was to prove oneself part of the group. In this way, geography was tied to culture, and memory was a bond stronger than walls. Even when writing appeared, oral tradition remained vital. Maps were fragile, scarce, and often inaccessible, but memory lived in everyone. Oral knowledge adapted quickly, incorporating new landmarks, new routes, new warnings. A bridge washed away or a new settlement built could be remembered in the next song or story. In this flexibility lay its greatest strength. It was always alive, always changing with the world it described that Tio modern eyes. Accustomed to paper charts or glowing screens, such reliance on memory may seem fragile. Yet for centuries it proved more than enough. People crossed mountains, deserts, and oceans guided not by ink, but by words, not by compasses, but by stories. Oral knowledge was a compass written in the heart, carried in the mind, and shared in the voice that in truth. Every route was a story, and every story was a map. And through these stories, countless generations found their way. Long before compasses pointed north with quiet certainty, people had already learned to trust the world itself as their guide. They read the sun and the shadows, the stars and the winds, the rivers and the ridges, the flight of birds and the growth of moss. Every detail of nature, every story passed from elder to child, was a part of a living map. To walk across the land or sail across the sea was to enter into conversation with the world, listening to its signs and trusting its patterns. For generations, navigation was not about tools, but about memory and attention. It was about noticing the way a tree leaned, or the way waves pressed against a boat, or the way a constellation rose in the evening sky. It was about repeating the stories of those who came before, carrying their wisdom forward so that each new traveler was never alone, but always guided by the past. When compasses finally appeared, they did not erase this older wisdom, but added to it. Yet the memory of those earlier methods still lingers, reminding us of a time when the earth itself was the only guide, when patience and observation were the most reliable instruments a person could possess. That to think of those journeys now is to remember how close people once lived to the rhythms of nature. They did not walk blindly, but with eyes open to every sign around them. They did not see the world as empty, but as alive with meaning. And in this closeness lies a quiet lesson for us still. That direction is not always about devices, but about trust, attention, and the stories we carry. Thank you for joining this calm journey with boring history for sleep. If you enjoyed this gentle exploration of how people once found their way without compasses, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so that you can return for more quiet wanderings into the forgotten corners of history. Good night.